I guess I've always been someone who thought I had everything figured out. I mean, I wasn't blind to the fact that things weren't perfect, but I was too busy to really care. My life was busy. Work, endless meetings, projects, deadlines, and the unspoken assumption that as long as we both kept climbing, we'd figure out whatever small cracks were showing in the foundation of our relationship. Emily, she's ambitious, intelligent, and in a lot of ways, far more successful than me. But that was always the dynamic. She was the one who thrived in the high-pressure world of corporate strategy, while I handled the financial end of things. Our companies had a good working relationship, and it kept us connected in a way, even though it was mostly professional. The thing is, when you're constantly juggling two high-powered careers, there's very little time left for personal things. Even when you're at home, you're often just physically there, mentally somewhere else. I try to talk to her about something, a casual chat about the day, or maybe something personal, but she'd barely look up, buried in emails or presentations. Our home became a place of routines. Dinner was eaten in silence, or sometimes with the TV blaring in the background. We were two people coexisting under the same roof, but emotionally, we were strangers. I didn't think much of it at first. The truth was, I had my own distractions. I'd bury myself in work, telling myself that the distance was just part of the sacrifice of building a career. But if I'm being honest, I started noticing the silence between us more and more. It all started to shift when she met Ryan. He was this young, up-and-coming guy from a new partnership team at her company. It didn't take long for me to notice how often he'd show up at corporate events, or how she would come home with a spark in her eyes after discussing some new idea with him. I didn't think much of it at the time. I mean, she's got to network, right? She's got to keep moving forward. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little pang of jealousy. He was younger, smarter, and more ambitious. At least, that's how he came across. And Emily? She was brilliant, but she was tired. I could see it. I could feel it. She was just drained, like she was sinking into the routine of it all. Then, one day, I came home from work early to find Emily and Ryan talking in our living room. They were discussing some corporate partnership that had the potential to change things for both their companies. At first, it seemed like just another business conversation, but there was something in the way they looked at each other. There was a warmth, a connection that I hadn't seen in years. Ryan was leaning forward, listening intently to her, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, like he was trying to get as close as possible to her without being too obvious about it. She didn't see it, though, or at least, she didn't acknowledge it. And maybe, at first, I didn't either. I mean, they were just talking shop, right? But as the days went on, I noticed more and more of them spending time together outside of work. Drinks after office hours, dinners, private meetings. The thing was, I couldn't tell if it was just business, or if there was something else brewing. I wanted to ignore it. After all, what could I do? We were both busy people, trying to juggle our careers and maintain a marriage that had long since lost its spark. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had no right to question her, not after the way I had been neglecting her. But it didn't sit right with me. It was around then that Thomas noticed a change in her. He had been friends with me for years, and he and Emily had a strange kind of friendship. She trusted him, and he always seemed to have an ear for her. I didn't think much of it when she started talking to him more often. Thomas was the kind of guy who always had advice. Some good, some bad, but he was a good listener. "Emily," he said one evening when I wasn't around, "you've been different lately. What's going on?" I didn't know about this conversation until later, when Emily confessed that she'd been feeling lonely in our marriage. I was in the next room, and when I heard it, something inside me snapped. Loneliness? After everything we'd been through, she felt lonely? I tried to brush it off, though. I told myself I'd work harder, do better. But the truth was, the emotional gap between us had already widened, and nothing I could do now would change it. That night, I tried to talk to her. "Emily, we've been married for 5 years. What's going on? Why don't we talk anymore? Why do I feel like I'm living with a stranger?" She didn't even look at me. "I don't know, James. Maybe because we don't have anything to talk about anymore." That was the first time I felt something break. It wasn't a loud crash, but a subtle, suffocating sense of dread. It was like we were already mourning the loss of something we hadn't realized was slipping away. She seemed distant, unreachable. I started to wonder if there was something more with Ryan, but I couldn't bring myself to ask. What would I say? I couldn't accuse her of something I wasn't sure of. But I had this feeling, this gut instinct, that something was off. Something was slipping through my fingers, and I wasn't ready to face it yet. But I wasn't blind. I could feel the shift. I knew what was coming. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure I could stop it. The line between professional and personal began to blur so slowly that I didn't even notice until I found myself crossing it. Ryan, as charming and persistent as he was, hadn't just earned my trust. He had also begun to pull at something inside of me I hadn't realized I was missing. Something I hadn't felt in years. It started with the small things. A casual after-work drink here and there. Nothing unusual. I convinced myself it was just business, just a way to network. But slowly, as we spent more time together, our conversations began to shift. We started talking less about work and more about ourselves. Ryan told me about his family, his childhood, his struggles, things I hadn't expected him to share. He was real with me, and in return, I found myself opening up too. I talked about my frustrations with my marriage, the loneliness that had quietly settled in over the years. I didn't know how to admit it, but with Ryan, I didn't have to. He didn't judge me. He listened. He understood in a way James never did anymore. I felt heard. For the first time in a long time, I felt understood. And it was intoxicating. Then one evening, after a particularly long day, we found ourselves at a small, dimly lit bar, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. We'd been talking for hours, and as the conversation shifted into more personal territory, the air between us thickened. We were sitting closer than we ever had before. Our words becoming quieter, more intimate. Ryan's hand brushed against mine. For a moment, I hesitated, but then his fingers wrapped around mine, gently but with an undeniable certainty. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something. Not just attraction, but a quiet invitation to step into something unknown, something dangerous. I didn't pull away. "I don't want to be just a work acquaintance to you, Emily," he said softly, his voice low. "I want more. I think you want more too." I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. It wasn't just the words that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the truth in them. I had been so lonely for so long, and in that moment, I didn't know if I was willing to fight against it anymore. Then, as if the weight of the moment demanded it, he leaned in. It wasn't an aggressive move, but a slow, tentative approach that left me with no time to think. Our lips met, soft and uncertain, but something inside me clicked. It was a kiss that felt both like an apology and a promise, an acknowledgement of everything I had been feeling but had never allowed myself to admit. The kiss was over quickly, and I pulled away, unsure of what to do with what had just happened. My breath caught in my throat. "Emily," Ryan whispered, "do you want this? Do you want to continue? I'm not asking you to make any big decisions right now, but I need to know if you're even considering it." I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I was considering it, and that terrified me. But in that moment, the weight of the years of emotional neglect, of the distance between James and me, made it all seem like a possibility. A scary, dangerous possibility. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I felt disconnected from everything, work, home, and especially from James. I tried to return to my normal routine, to pretend like nothing had changed, but I couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted. Something deep inside me had been awakened. And now, I was afraid of losing it. James didn't notice, of course. He never noticed. He was wrapped up in his own world, buried in the aftermath of a financial crisis at his company. He came home late, stayed up even later, dealing with spreadsheets and numbers, while I sat alone, stewing in my thoughts. The emotional distance between us was suffocating. And the worst part was that I was beginning to realize that I couldn't go back to the way things had been. I tried to push away the guilt. I tried to convince myself it was just a moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I was torn, pulled between the comfortable, predictable routine of my marriage and the raw, intense connection I felt with Ryan. The weeks that followed were a blur. Ryan and I met more often. At first, it was innocent. Just walks, casual talks about nothing and everything. But soon, it wasn't enough. The kisses became longer, deeper, more desperate, and it was always followed by this sick feeling in my stomach, the knowledge that I was betraying my husband. But with Ryan, I didn't feel judged. I felt alive again. I felt like I was finally rediscovering a part of myself I had buried under the weight of my responsibilities. Meanwhile, James remained completely oblivious. He was so consumed with the problems at his company that I could have been a ghost for all he cared. I couldn't blame him. I had been absent in our marriage for so long. I had already become invisible to him. But even though I didn't have the courage to confront him, I felt the shift in him, too. I could tell he was starting to notice the distance, the way we barely spoke, the way I'd avoid looking him in the eyes. But he didn't say anything. He never said anything. I couldn't stop the guilt, but I couldn't stop what was happening either. My secret life with Ryan began to take over. Ava, one of my closest friends, started to notice the changes in me. She had always been sharp, always able to read me like a book. One night, after a particularly long evening of pretending everything was fine, she asked me flat out, "Emily, what's going on? You've been acting different." I'm not blind. I tried to brush it off, deny it, but she wouldn't let it go. "You've been spending a lot of time with Ryan," she said, a hint of suspicion in her voice. "Are you sure nothing is happening between you two?" I gave her a smile, forced and tight. "It's nothing, Ava. Just work stuff." But even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow. Ava didn't believe me, but she didn't push further. I'm sure she could see through the facade I was desperately trying to maintain. Then there was Thomas, always the voice of reason. He had been telling me for weeks that I needed to talk to James, to save my marriage before it was too late. But deep down, I knew that the choice had already been made. The path I was on, the one with Ryan, felt like the only way to break free from the suffocating life I had built with James. I didn't know how it would end, but I was already too far gone to turn back. I could feel it, that nagging feeling, creeping in at the edge of my mind. James was starting to notice. The quiet shifts, the way I pulled away from him, the late nights with Ryan. It was all starting to add up. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that maybe I was overthinking things, that he was just wrapped up in work and hadn't noticed yet. But deep down, I knew he wasn't blind. And then, it happened. I was at home, checking my phone, when I heard the front door open. James had returned early from his business trip. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe he had just finished early, or maybe the meeting had gone better than expected. But when I glanced up, I saw the way he was looking at me, distant, cold, like he was studying me. Something shifted in him that day, something I couldn't place at first, but I felt it. It was like he had already decided what was happening, but he wasn't going to confront me directly. Not yet. It wasn't until the next day that the full weight of his suspicions hit me. I had left my phone on the counter while I was making coffee, and James, apparently out of some mix of curiosity and frustration, picked it up. I didn't know he had even touched it until I saw the way his face went pale when I walked back into the room. "You've been texting him again," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. My heart stopped for a moment. Ryan. I could tell by the way he said it, by the look in his eyes. He knew. He had seen the messages. My immediate instinct was to lie, to cover it up, but I couldn't. Not when the guilt was written all over my face. Before I could even say anything, he spoke again. "And there's this too." He held up my phone, showing me a picture that Ryan had taken of us during one of our late-night meetings. It was innocent enough. Just a photo of us standing on a balcony after a corporate event, laughing, but I could see the way his eyes narrowed as he stared at it. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I had been trying to deny the gravity of everything, but now I could see it in James's eyes. The hurt, the betrayal, the realization that everything was falling apart. I could have apologized. I could have confessed, but I didn't. I was too scared, too ashamed. And deep down, a small part of me didn't want to stop. But instead of confronting me directly, James did something I hadn't expected. He didn't yell. He didn't storm off. Instead, he did what James always did when things got hard. He took action, but not the kind I anticipated. He started playing a game, and I had no idea just how deep he would take it. I didn't know it at the time, but James had already begun to turn the tables. He used his position, his financial connections, to start making things difficult for Ryan. It was subtle at first. Small changes in contracts, pressure on Ryan's partners to delay deals, minor financial complications that would make Ryan's business dealings a nightmare. James knew how to make the wheels of the corporate world grind slowly but painfully. And Ryan, as I would later learn, began to feel it. I noticed the stress in his face, the way he would look over his shoulder, the nervous energy that started to creep into his once confident demeanor. He didn't talk about it, of course. He tried to play it off, like everything was fine. But I could see it, the cracks in his facade. One evening, we were having dinner at a small restaurant, trying to act normal, but I could feel the tension between us. He kept checking his phone, glancing around, and I could sense something was off. I asked him if everything was okay, but he just shrugged it off. "It's just work stuff," he said with a forced smile. But I knew. It wasn't just work. Something was happening, and I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't until later, when Ava reached out to me, that I started to understand just how bad things were. "You need to talk to Ryan," she said one afternoon. "He's not himself. I've been getting strange vibes from him. He's avoiding you, Emily. I don't think it's just business." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Ryan avoiding me? He was the one who had been so persistent, so eager to spend time with me. But now? Now, he was pulling away, and I had no idea why. I didn't want to believe it, but Ava's words echoed in my head long after we hung up. I started to wonder if Ryan had caught wind of something. Maybe he had noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere, or maybe, just maybe, James was starting to take action without me even realizing it. Meanwhile, James seemed to grow colder with each passing day. The emotional distance was palpable now, but he didn't confront me. He didn't yell or accuse me. Instead, he stayed silent, allowing his actions to speak louder than anything he could say. It was the kind of silence that was suffocating. I couldn't stop it, and I didn't know how to fix it. Thomas tried to reach out to James again, offering help, offering to talk to him. I overheard the conversation one night, and when I heard James's response, I knew exactly where things stood. "I don't want to talk," James said, his voice hard and detached. "There's nothing to talk about anymore. She's made her choice." It hit me like a punch to the stomach. There was no going back. James wasn't just hurt, he was angry. And I wasn't sure if I could ever make things right again. But it didn't matter. I had already made my choice too. And now, I was stuck in this twisted game. A game that was quickly spiraling out of control. Everything was falling apart, and neither of us was willing to stop it. James was no longer the man I married. The transformation was subtle at first, but then it became impossible to ignore. He had made his decision, and it wasn't just about ruining my career or Ryan's. No, he wanted something more. He wanted to destroy me, to take everything I thought I could hold on to, and tear it apart in the most personal way possible. It was as though everything in his life had been shattered, not just the business or our marriage, but his very sense of self. He felt humiliated, abandoned, and betrayed. And now, he was going to make sure that I felt the same way. He didn't just want to punish me. He wanted to break me. James didn't stop at manipulating Ryan. No, he took things even further. In the coldest, most calculated way, he turned to Sarah, my best friend, the one person I had trusted implicitly. She had always been there for me, always supported me, and I thought she was someone I could count on no matter what. But James saw her as an opportunity, a means to an end, and she, despite her loyalty to me, fell for it. I never saw it coming. Sarah had always admired James. I knew that. She had always mentioned how attractive she thought he was, but I thought it was just harmless admiration. I had no idea that beneath her friendly exterior, there was a quiet longing for him. And James? He knew exactly how to play it. He showered her with attention, made her feel seen, wanted, desired. He was a master at manipulation, and Sarah was no match for him. It started slowly, with small gestures, little compliments that only she noticed. He'd talk to her more, invite her to dinner, find reasons to be alone with her. At first, Sarah was surprised, confused, even. She had always respected the boundaries of our friendship, but when James started showing interest in her, something shifted. She couldn't resist him. Not with the way he looked at her, not with the way he made her feel. And I was oblivious. I was so consumed with my own confusion and guilt over my affair with Ryan that I didn't even notice what was happening between James and Sarah. I couldn't. I was too wrapped up in my own misery, too lost in my own spiral of betrayal to see that the man I had betrayed had already found his revenge. Things with James began to change. He was distant in some ways, but more attentive in others. He started showering me with attention again. Not the kind of attention I wanted, but the kind that felt hollow, manipulative. He bought me gifts, he showed up at my work events, he would call me more often, acting like the husband I once knew. But there was something off about it. It was as though he was playing a role, as if he was trying to be the husband he thought I wanted, but in a way that made me feel like I was being controlled. I started to feel unsettled. He seemed so eager to please me, but it didn't feel genuine. It felt like a performance. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could tell something was wrong. I began to wonder if he was somehow playing me, trying to manipulate me the way I had manipulated him. The truth hit me when I least expected it. I was scrolling through my phone one evening, trying to get a grip on everything, when I saw the photo. At first, it seemed like just another innocent picture, one of James and Sarah, laughing together at a restaurant. But then, I looked closer. They were sitting too close. Their bodies were touching in a way that was far too intimate. My heart stopped as I realized what it meant. This wasn't just a friendly dinner. This was a moment between two people who had crossed a line they both knew they shouldn't have. I felt sick. Betrayal burned in my chest as the truth sunk in. James, the man I had betrayed with Ryan, had done the exact same thing. But he hadn't just turned to anyone. He had turned to Sarah, my best friend, the person I had trusted most in the world. It was as if the universe had conspired against me. Everything I had ever known was falling apart. I confronted them, of course. My world crumbled in that moment. I found James and Sarah together, and when I asked them about it, they didn't even seem to care. There was no guilt, no apology, just cold indifference. James barely looked up from his phone when he said, "I just returned the favor. I think we're even now." His words echoed in my mind, and I felt like I was drowning. Everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, about my marriage, was a lie. James didn't even seem to feel remorse. In his mind, this was justice, a tit-for-tat game that had somehow justified everything. But it didn't feel like justice. It felt like a slow, brutal death. Sarah stood there, her face pale, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She had wanted this, had wanted him for so long, and now she had him. I couldn't even look at her. She wasn't the woman I had called a friend. She was a stranger, someone who had destroyed everything I thought we had. And then there was James, the man I had once loved, the man I had built my life with. He wasn't the person I had married. He wasn't even the person I thought he was. Now, he was someone else entirely. Someone who had destroyed everything I held dear without a second thought. In that moment, I became numb. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, unable to process it all. The pain was too much to bear, too overwhelming. My marriage, my best friend, everything had shattered in front of me, and I didn't know how to put it all back together. Ryan continued to try and reach out to me, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I had already been living in a fog of lies and manipulation, and now that fog had consumed me entirely. I could no longer see the truth, no longer separate the lies from the reality. All I could feel was the weight of everything I had lost. Ava, seeing me spiral further into despair, tried to intervene. She begged me to leave James, to leave behind the pain he had caused me. "You deserve more than this," she said, but I couldn't hear her. I couldn't see a way out. I had already lost myself. I had no idea who I was anymore. I had betrayed my husband, and now he had done the same to me. I had destroyed everything I had built, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't even know if I wanted to anymore. The weight of everything that had happened hit me all at once. I had never felt so overwhelmed, so suffocated by the chaos I had created. The guilt was unbearable, the affair with Ryan, the betrayal of James, and now the crushing realization that James had done the same thing with Sarah. My world had become a tangled mess of lies, and I couldn't tell where the truth ended and the lies began. Every time I tried to breathe, It felt like I was drowning. I was trapped in a cage of my own making, and there was no escape. I began to fall apart. I couldn't hold it together any longer. The woman I had once been, confident, driven, certain of who I was, seemed like a distant memory. Now, I was lost. I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. I thought about James and Sarah, about how everything that once mattered was now destroyed. I thought about Ryan, and how I had betrayed him too. But the truth was, I had betrayed myself more than anyone, and no amount of apologizing or fixing could undo that. James, though, remained unrepentant. His eyes were cold as he watched me break down, and I could see it in his face. He believed he had won. He had taken control of the situation that had once made him feel powerless. His revenge had been executed perfectly in his mind. He felt vindicated. But deep down, I could see it in him too, the emptiness. He may have thought he had restored his pride, but in doing so, he had destroyed everything. There was no joy in his victory, just hollow satisfaction. His relationship with Sarah had already begun to lose its sheen, and he knew it. The pleasure he had once felt in his manipulation and retaliation was fading, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. But I couldn't stay there, in that house, in that life. I needed to leave. I needed to find some way to escape the mess I had created. So, I packed my things. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay another minute in the place that had once been home. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to clear my mind, but all I could think about was how much I had lost. My marriage was over. My trust in people was shattered. But I couldn't just give up. I couldn't let myself be swallowed by the wreckage. It was in that solitude, in that time away from everything, that I began to truly reflect. I realized that for so long, I had lived for others, for my career, for James, for appearances. I had sacrificed myself, my needs, my happiness in the name of pleasing everyone around me. And now, with everything broken, I had nothing left to give. I had to rebuild. I had to find myself again. After a long period of soul-searching, I made a decision. I would never return to James. I wouldn't beg for his love or try to fix what was already broken. I couldn't. I had to rebuild my life from scratch, and that meant walking away from the toxic cycle that had consumed me for so long. So, I took the first step. I transferred to a new company, one where I could start fresh. I began attending therapy to untangle the mess of emotions inside me, to heal the wounds I had inflicted on myself. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I was drowning in guilt and shame, but I was determined. I knew the road to healing would be long, but I was willing to walk it. James, on the other hand, was spiraling. He watched me leave, knowing that he had lost me forever. He tried to bury himself in his work, in his relationship with Sarah, but it wasn't the same. The emptiness he had tried to fill with revenge and vindication was now consuming him. Sarah, too, was pulling away. She had once been a source of pleasure and escape for him, but now, she seemed like just another piece of the broken puzzle he had created. He tried to cling to the satisfaction of his revenge, but he knew, deep down, that he had destroyed everything that once mattered to him. The satisfaction of punishing me, of punishing Ryan, was fleeting. It didn't fill the void. It didn't give him the happiness he had hoped for. He was left with nothing but regret and the aftermath of his choices. Ava, ever the loyal friend, became my constant support during this painful process. She stood by me as I struggled to heal, offering words of encouragement when I felt like giving up. She urged me to rediscover the things that made me happy before all of this started, to reconnect with the woman I had lost. Slowly, with her help, I began to find my way again. As for Ryan, he too sensed the weight of everything that had happened. He saw the pain in my eyes, and he understood that I needed time to heal. He didn't want to complicate my journey of self-discovery, so he made the difficult decision to step back. He left me a letter, expressing his regret for his part in the affair, acknowledging that we were both broken people who needed time to rebuild. I didn't know if we would ever find our way back to each other, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally on my own path. And so, the story of James and Emily came to an end. We were both left to pick up the pieces of our broken lives. I found a new sense of freedom and purpose as I began my career anew and worked through the emotional baggage of my past. It wasn't easy, but I was no longer afraid. I had reclaimed my life. The shadow of betrayal no longer controlled me. James, on the other hand, remained stuck in the bitterness of his own choices. His revenge may have been sweet at first, but the aftermath left him lost, directionless, and alone. He had destroyed the people he once loved, and now, he was left with nothing but the consequences of his actions. The story ends with Emily standing at the beginning of a new path, uncertain of what the future holds, but confident in the knowledge that she has reclaimed her life. She will no longer live in the past or allow the ghosts of betrayal to haunt her. For the first time in a long time, Emily is free.